Old Soul Farm.
40 men stood in the spring mud at the Kirchner auction on a Saturday in April of 1967, and not one of them thought to ask the question that would have changed everything they thought they knew about the woman standing at the back of the crowd. The question was this: why would a 29-year-old farmer pay $35 for a tractor with no engine in it? It was a simple question. Any one of those men could have asked it. The auctioneer could have asked it before he banged the gavel. The scrap dealer named Horvath, who had dropped his hand at $20, could have asked it while he watched her sign the papers. Harlan Beckwith, the John Deere dealer, who started laughing the second her truck rolled past his showroom, could have asked it any time in the next 11 months while he was telling the men at the co-op breakfast that she was going to lose her farm by April. Her own mother on the phone from Wisconsin Rapids, calling every Sunday evening, could have asked it. Nobody asked. Because nobody in Adams County in the spring of 1967 believed that a woman who farmed alone on 140 acres of sandy ground could possibly have a reason. They thought she was sentimental. They thought she was stubborn. They thought she was watching her dead father's farm slip away from her one bad decision at a time. And they thought $35 on a piece of useless iron was just the latest of those decisions. Some of them felt sorry for her. Most of them just laughed. 11 months later, on the 1st of April in 1968, every one of those men would have his answer. And one of them, Harlan Beckwith, would walk into the co-op breakfast at 7 in the morning, take off his hat in front of 23 farmers, and say the words no equipment dealer in Wisconsin had probably ever said before. But the answer to the question was not a single thing. It was 4 things. A diesel engine the Army had thrown away. A blueprint drawn by a dead man and pinned under a coffee can on a workbench. A letter from a bank that arrived in early May and gave her exactly 11 months to do the impossible and the worst winter Adams County had seen in 32 years. The winter that would freeze every modern John Deere in 3 townships and leave one tractor still running, a $35 tractor with an $85 engine inside it, driven by the woman the whole county had laughed at.
This is the story of those 11 months, of the night a daughter found something her father had left behind and decided not to sell the farm, of the August evening when everything she had built fell apart in 3 seconds, and an old man named Walt told her a secret about her own father that she had never known, of the morning at 34 below zero when she drove a $35 tractor 11 miles in the dark to save a neighbor's herd, and of the October afternoon in 1984, 17 years later, when a check she wrote in cash at a foreclosure auction would change 3 families forever. If you have ever been counted out by people who never asked the right question, this story is for you. Stay with me. There is a fairground in 1998 where this ends, and an 81-year-old woman standing in front of a tractor who is going to say 6 words to her daughter that I want you to hear. Go back to the beginning. The second Saturday of April 1967. The Kirchner Estate Auction outside Friendship, Wisconsin. A muddy lot behind a dairy barn that no one would milk in again because Vernon Kirchner had died in February owing more than his land was worth. And the bank had moved with the efficiency banks move with when there are no relatives left to stall them. By 3 in the afternoon, the good iron was gone. The milking stanchions had sold early. The hay elevator had brought decent money. A serviceable Oliver plow had changed hands for $60. And the crowd had murmured because 60 was fair. 40 men stood in the spring mud with their hands jammed into jacket pockets, boot heels sinking slow into the soft ground, breath still showing white in the cold afternoon air, waiting for the last item so they could go home and start evening chores. The auctioneer looked at his clipboard the way a man looks at a piece of paper he is hoping will rewrite itself. He looked at the far end of the lot behind a pile of cedar fence posts that nobody had bid on either. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Folks," he said, "last item, 1952 Farmall Super M. No engine, no starter, no generator, no carburetor. Wheels and a frame and not much else. Somebody give me $20 for the iron weight." A few men turned their heads. Most did not bother. An engineless tractor at a farm auction was not a curiosity. It was a punchline. Somebody had pulled the motor out years ago, and nobody remembered why, and nobody had cared enough to ask. The tractor had been sitting in a fence row since the Eisenhower years. Leaves had packed into the empty hood cavity in compressed layers that smelled of rot and old tannin. Mice had nested in the wiring and chewed through every insulated wire they could find. Rain had pulled into the bell housing and rusted the clutch plate into a single fused disc of orange iron oxide that would never turn again. The signature red of International Harvester had faded to the color of weathered brick. You could stand at the front of the machine and look straight through to the firewall. There was nothing there. A shell. A tin can on wheels. A scrap dealer named Horvath raised his hand from the back row, his face neutral, his eyes already calculating the trip back to his yard and the price per ton of cold iron. 20. The auctioneer nodded, grateful that someone had ended the silence. 20 going once, 20 going. 35, said a voice from the left side of the crowd. Heads turned. Some of them slowly, some of them quickly, all of them with the same expression, which was the expression a man wears when a woman speaks at an auction where women do not speak. When the woman is 29 years old and wearing a canvas jacket that belonged to a dead man. When the woman is one of those Holden girls from the Friendship Road who farms 140 acres of sandy ground without a husband and without a hired hand, and apparently without enough sense to recognize when she is being offered an opportunity to walk away from a piece of useless steel. Della Holden stood at the edge of the crowd. 5'7", 130 pounds. Dark hair pulled back with a rubber band the way she pulled it back every working morning of her life. Her father Otto's jacket hung past her hips, and the sleeves were rolled twice at the cuffs. Her hands at her sides were calloused in patterns that no one in that crowd would have recognized, because the calluses came from machinist tools and not from farmer implements. The hard ridges along the insides of her fingers came from gripping lathe handles. The ridges across the heels of her palms came from the cranks of a Bridgeport milling machine. She did not look at any of the men who were looking at her. She looked at the tractor. Horvath, the scrap dealer, ran his numbers in his head. At $35, he was bidding above the scrap value. He shrugged. He dropped his hand. The auctioneer waited the beat that auctioneers wait. No one else moved. The gavel came down softer than usual, almost apologetic. The way a man closes a door he is not proud of having opened. Sold. $35. Miss Holden. She walked through the thinning crowd without hurrying and without speaking. She put one hand flat on the frame rail just below where the hood met the cowl, and the steel was cold under her palm. Cold from sitting in Wisconsin shade through 5 winters, but it was solid. She could feel the weight of the machine through that single point of contact, the way a doctor feels a pulse through the fingertips. The frame was heavy and balanced. The wide front axle sat square and true. The spindles were still tight in their bushings. The rear end, the transmission housing the final drives, this was International Harvester's best work. From the early 50s, bulletproof gearing built for a generation of farmers who expected their machinery to last 20 years and would accept nothing less. A rear axle assembly that could absorb twice the torque the factory engine had ever produced without complaint. She was not looking at what was missing. She was looking at what was there. The men around her could not have understood the difference if she had drawn it for them with a pencil. They saw a hole where an engine used to be. She saw a foundation waiting for a different kind of building. Two men helped her push the Farmall up a set of ramps onto her flatbed. Without the engine, the tractor was light enough that 3 people could roll it across level ground. She chained it down twice. She checked the chains twice. She climbed into the cab of her Ford pickup, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot onto County Road J, heading south toward home. She passed the co-op in Friendship on the way home. The co-op was the center of agricultural commerce in Adams County, a cluster of cinderblock buildings where farmers bought seed and fertilizer and fuel and stood around in groups of 3 and 4, talking about weather and prices and each other. The Beckwith equipment lot occupied the adjacent property, a long, low building under a green and yellow sign with a row of new John Deere tractors arranged along the road frontage like soldiers at inspection. Harlan Beckwith was leaning against the doorframe of his showroom that afternoon, counting trucks the way he counted trucks every Saturday on a sale day, keeping mental inventory of every farmer in a 30-mile radius. Harlan was 42 years old, 6'1", 210 pounds, hair gone gray at the temples, in the way that men with money find flattering. He had been selling John Deeres in Adams County for 20 years. He knew who was running old iron. He knew who was one breakdown away from a new payment book. He knew the rhythms of wear and failure across the entire county, the way a weatherman knows pressure systems. He saw the Engineless Farmall on the flatbed. He recognized the truck. He started laughing before the truck had passed the gas pumps. I was still laughing 30 seconds later, walking back into his showroom when he stopped at the front desk and said the words that would be repeated at every coffee table and every parts counter in Adams County by Tuesday morning. The Holden girl just bought a tractor with no engine. I am not joking. No engine. The thing is a shell. You can see straight through it. Tin can with wheels. What is she going to do with it? Plant it. The man at the counter laughed because Harlan Beckwith was the kind of man whose laughter you joined whether you found the joke funny or not. He was the kind of man who made it expensive to disagree with him. By Wednesday, Harlan had said something else, and this was the thing that mattered. The thing that would not go away once he had said it. The thing his pride would chain him to for the next 11 months, whether he wanted to be chained or not. He said it at the regular co-op breakfast that Wednesday morning with 23 farmers and the parts manager and the seed dealer, all within earshot, his voice carrying the way Harlan Beckwith's voice always carried. I will put my reputation on it, he said. I have been selling agricultural equipment in this county for 20 years. I know what works and what does not. The Holden girl is going to lose her farm by the 1st of April. You can mark it on your calendar. The bank will not carry her another season. That tractor will be scrapped by Christmas. And if I am wrong, I will walk into this co-op on the first day of next April and admit it in front of every man at this table. You have my word. Few of the men nodded the way men nod when they are not sure what they are agreeing to. A few said nothing. Boyd Kreger, who was sitting at the end of the table near the window, set his coffee cup down quietly and did not say anything at all because Boyd Kreger had helped Della rebuild her east fence the winter her father died, and Boyd Kreger had stood in that workshop and looked at the tools on the walls, and Boyd Kreger knew something Harlan Beckwith did not know. But Boyd Kreger also knew that a man who walks into a co-op breakfast and contradicts Harlan Beckwith goes home with one less friend in the equipment business. And so Boyd kept his quiet, and the moment passed, and the joke about the Holden girl and her tin can began to travel. What no one in that co-op knew, what they would not know until the following spring, was that Della Holden had not been guessing. She had not bought that tractor on impulse. She had bought it because she already owned the engine. October 1966, 6 months before the Kirchner auction. Della had driven her Ford pickup 40 miles north to Fort McCoy, the Army base outside Toma, where the military sold off decommissioned equipment 4 times a year. The surplus yard was open to civilians from 8 to 4. She had signed in at the gate and shown her driver's license and walked the rows of pallets under a gray Wisconsin sky that promised rain but had not yet delivered. She had moved slowly, reading tags, checking serial numbers, ignoring the trucks and the canvas and the mess equipment, looking for one specific thing. She found it on the 3rd row, a Continental CD193 diesel engine, 4 cylinders, 193 cubic inches of displacement, rated by the Army at 48 horsepower, which was a number Della knew to be conservative because her father Otto had examined one of these engines at a surplus sale in 1961 and had told her the truth about it. That engine makes 55 horsepower, maybe 60 if you tune it right, he had said, standing in the surplus yard at Camp Douglas, turning the crankshaft of a CD193 by hand and listening to the compression. The Army rates everything low. Reliability margins. They want an engine rated at 50 to actually make 60 so it never works hard, so it never breaks. The real output is higher than the tag says. More importantly, the CD193 was a diesel. The Farmall Super M had come from the factory with a gasoline engine making 44 horsepower at the drawbar. Gas engines had their virtues, but economy was not among them. They burned expensive fuel. They wore out faster. The spark ignition added complexity and failure points. A diesel ran on cheaper fuel, lasted longer, made more torque at low RPM, and ignited its own fuel through compression alone. No spark plugs, no distributor, no points to wear out and go out of adjustment. Exactly the characteristics you needed for heavy pulling in sandy Wisconsin soil, where the ground grabbed at plow bottoms like wet cement. And the tractor that survived was the tractor that could lug through resistance without stalling. Della had found her engine that afternoon. It was bolted to a mounting frame inside a generator housing that the Army had condemned. The generator was junk. The engine inside it was fine. The tag wired to the lifting eye read, "Serviceable. Remove for unit replacement." The Army had pulled a working diesel out of a generator set simply because the generator itself was obsolete, superseded by a newer model. A perfectly good machine discarded because the box it served was no longer needed. Della had read the tag twice. Serviceable. She had understood that feeling better than she wanted to admit. She knew what it was like to be functional inside a frame the world had written off. She found the yard sergeant, a thick-necked man named Kowalski, who ran civilian sales with the bored efficiency of a man who had been doing the same job for 15 years. And she asked him about the Continental. He pulled the inventory sheet. He confirmed the engine was tagged serviceable. He quoted her a price, $85, for a running diesel engine that would have cost $1,200 new from Continental Motors in Muskegon. For an engine that made more power on cheaper fuel with longer service life than the $400 gasoline engine the factory had designed for the Farmall Super M. Della wrote a check. Kowalski helped her rig a chain hoist to lift the engine out of the generator housing and onto the bed of her truck, and he helped because he was curious about the young woman buying a surplus diesel and asking technical questions about injector timing and compression ratios that most of his own motor pool mechanics could not have answered. The engine sat on her truck bed, 400 pounds of cast iron and steel olive drab and anonymous, a military heart waiting for a civilian body. She had driven it home that afternoon and parked it in her father's workshop next to the Bridgeport mill. She had waited 6 months. She had farmed through the summer and fall of '66. She had checked the auction notices in the Adams County paper every week, looking for a Farmall Super M frame. She needed the frame to be empty. A tractor with a seized engine would mean hours of removal work and a power plant she did not want. A tractor with a running engine would cost too much and come with the wrong heart. She had needed a shell. In March of '67, she had seen the listing. Kirchner Estate. Friendship. Equipment list included one line that made her pulse quicken. 1952 Farmall Super M no engine. She had read it twice. She had folded the paper, put it in the pocket of her father's canvas jacket, and gone to the workshop to check the blueprint one more time. Now you have to understand the blueprint. You have to understand how it came to be on the workbench in the first place. Because Della Holden had not found that drawing by accident. The drawing had found her, and the night it found her was the night that everything she would become began. Otto Holden had come to America in 1928. Not because Germany lacked opportunity for a young machinist, but because his older brother had written from Wisconsin about cheap land in a new country, and the feeling of owning ground that belonged to you and not to a landlord, or a government, or the memory of a war. Otto had arrived in Adams County with a machinist's tool chest that weighed more than his suitcase, $400 in savings, and almost no English. He had bought 140 acres of sandy marginal ground south of Friendship. The kind of soil that the established farmers with the good bottomland did not want, the kind of soil that was therefore the only soil that an immigrant with $400 could afford. He had never made much money farming. The sandy ground was not built for high yields. 80 bushels of corn in a good year, 60 in a bad one, some years worse. But what Otto Holden lacked in income, he made up for in the ability to build anything the farm needed from whatever materials were available. He built his own equipment, not modified equipment, not equipment with aftermarket parts, built from nothing, from scrap and surplus and bar stock and castings and the contents of his own head. His first tractor in 1934 had been assembled from a Model A Ford engine pulled from a wrecked car, a truck transmission bought at a junkyard in Portage, and a frame he welded from railroad rail that he cut with a hacksaw in the long Wisconsin evenings. The tractor looked like a fever dream, all odd angles and improvised brackets. No sheet metal covering the mechanical works. It looked like the skeleton of a tractor, the bones without the skin. But it plowed straight. It did not break. And it cost $22 in parts and a month of winter evenings in the shop. Della was his only child. Eleanor had wanted more. Children had prayed for them in the Lutheran church in Friendship every Sunday for years, but the children had not come. So Otto taught Della what he would have taught a son, because the knowledge had to go somewhere. Knowledge that is not passed down dies with the man who holds it. By 12, she could run the lathe, not play with it, run it, turning steel to dimension with the steady hand and the measured eye that the work demanded, reading the micrometer to 1/10 of a 1,000th of an inch, adjusting feed rates by sound, because a lathe cutting properly makes a particular hiss, and a lathe cutting too hard makes a different sound entirely. And Otto had taught her to hear the difference before she could articulate what it meant. By 18, she understood metallurgy and heat treatment and dimensional tolerances, the way most farm kids understood planting dates and fertilizer rates. She knew that 4-140 steel could be hardened to Rockwell 60 but would be brittle above 55. She knew that aluminum expanded faster than steel when heated, and that this difference could be used to shrink fit a bearing onto a shaft. She knew that 1,000th of an inch was the thickness of a human hair, and that the difference between 1,000th and 2,000ths was the difference between a machine that ran smooth and a machine that destroyed itself. Otto did not just teach her how to make parts. He taught her how to think about machines. A factory builds what it can sell, he had told her one evening at the lathe. A machinist builds what she needs. The factory is limited by profit. The machinist is limited only by what she knows. Della was 27 when Otto died, November of 1965. Heart attack. It happened in the shop, the only place it could have happened, because the shop was where Otto spent every hour the farm did not claim. He was rebuilding a hydraulic control valve for the three-point hitch when his heart gave out. They found him on the concrete floor beside the milling machine. The wrench was still in his right hand. His left hand was resting on the base of the lathe, as if he had reached out in the last moment to steady himself against the only thing in the world he trusted to be perfectly true. Della inherited the farm, the workshop. Every tool Otto had spent 30 years collecting and maintaining and arranging on those shelves with such care. She also inherited his way of seeing machines and his loneliness, though she did not recognize that part of it yet. The months after were the worst of her life. Not because of the grief alone, though the grief was constant, a presence in every room and every furrow. The months were the worst because of the silence. The shop was silent. No lathe running, no mill cutting, no forge hissing. The sounds that had filled her life since childhood, the background music of a machinist's household, were gone. The house was silent. Eleanor had moved to her sister's place in Wisconsin Rapids 2 weeks after the funeral, unable to stay in the house where her husband had lived for 37 years, and died on a Tuesday afternoon with his hand on a wrench. Della understood why her mother left. She did not blame her, but the understanding did not fill the empty rooms. Eleanor called every Sunday evening and asked the same question in different words. How long are you going to do this? When are you going to come to your senses? Your father worked himself to death on that farm, Della. Are you going to do the same thing? Eleanor never said sell. She said, think about your future. She said, there is more to life than sandy ground. She said your father loved you, but he would not want you to be alone out there. The words were different each Sunday. The meaning was the same. In February of 1966, 3 months after Otto died, Della picked up the telephone on a Monday morning and called a real estate man in Wisconsin Rapids, whose name Eleanor had given her. She told him she was ready to list the property. He said he would drive out the following Monday to take photographs and write up the listing. She hung up the phone. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, looking out the window at the workshop. The building was dark. She had not turned on the lights in there for 2 weeks. On Sunday night, the night before the real estate man was scheduled to arrive, Della could not sleep. She lay in bed in the dark, listening to the farmhouse settle and creak in the February cold, listening to the wind push against the windows, listening to the silence where her father's voice should have been. At 2 in the morning, she got up, pulled on her boots and the canvas jacket, and walked across the frozen yard to the workshop. She turned on the overhead lights. The fluorescent tubes flickered and buzzed, and then caught filling the shop with the flat, shadowless light that Otto had preferred, because it showed the true surface of metal, without the distortions that incandescent bulbs created. The shop looked exactly as it had looked the day Otto died. The lathe, the mill, the forge, the welding table, the pegboard walls hung with wrenches and hammers and files and specialty tools in the exact positions Otto had assigned them. Each tool outlined in black marker, so you could see at a glance if anything was missing. The concrete floor was clean because Otto had swept it every night of his working life, and Della had continued sweeping it each time she entered, even when she had no reason to enter. Even when the entering was a form of worship she could not name. She walked to the workbench. The bench was a slab of maple 3 inches thick that Otto had planned and finished in 1949. Its surface was marked with decades of use, small dents and scratches and burn marks from hot metal. But it was level and solid, and it would be level and solid 100 years from now. That was when she saw the drafting paper. It was pinned under a coffee can full of quarter-20 bolts, half hidden by a stack of old machinery catalogs. She had walked past it a dozen times since November without noticing it, because it looked like just another piece of the shop's accumulation, another layer of the sediment that 30 years of work deposits in a workspace. She pulled it free. She unrolled it on the bench. The paper was 24 by 36 standard drafting size, the kind Otto bought in rolls from a supply house in Milwaukee. On it, in Otto's precise mechanical pencil, was a diagram. It showed a Farmall Super M frame drawn in profile and from above, with critical dimensions marked at every structural point. Next to it, drawn to the same scale with the same precise hand, was a Continental CD193 diesel engine, its outline taken from the manufacturer's specification sheet, but redrawn with additional dimensions that Continental had never published. Dimensions that could only have been obtained by measuring an actual engine with calipers and micrometers. Between the two drawings connecting them was a third element, an adapter plate, drawn in cross-section and plan view, dimensioned down to the thousandth of an inch, with bolt patterns for both the Continental bell housing and the Farmall transmission case, drawn in overlapping circles that showed exactly where each hole must be bored to mate the two machines together. Crankshaft flange specifications, flywheel clearances, pilot bore diameter, mounting pad locations, everything needed to install a military surplus diesel in a Farmall frame. In the lower right corner of the drawing, in Otto's handwriting, small and precise and unmistakable, were the words: CD193 and Super M frame, 55 to 60 horsepower estimated. Diesel fuel economy. Project note, see folder. There was no folder. She would search for it later. She would go through every drawer and every shelf for a week, and she would never find one. Perhaps Otto had never started it. Perhaps the blueprint was as far as he had gotten. Perhaps he had run out of time, the way all mortal machinists eventually run out of time no matter how carefully they measure. But the blueprint was enough. The critical dimensions were there. The concept was complete. The adapter plate was fully specified. Her father had been planning this conversion before he died. He had been thinking about it. He had been drawing it. He had not finished. Della stood in the shop holding the blueprint. The fluorescent lights hummed. The building ticked and settled in the cold. She could feel her father's presence, not his ghost, his intention. The blueprint was a message, a set of instructions left behind by a man who knew perhaps that he might not be the one to follow them. A last project, an unfinished sentence that only she had the skills and the knowledge and the tools to complete. She pinned the blueprint to the wall above the milling machine, in the spot where Otto had always pinned his current project drawings. She walked back to the house in the cold. She called the real estate man at 7 o'clock Monday morning before he could leave Wisconsin Rapids, and she told him not to come. She told him she had changed her mind. She told him the farm was not for sale. She called Eleanor at 8. "I am not selling, Mama," she said. "I found something Papa was working on. I am going to finish it." Eleanor was quiet on the line for 10 seconds. Then she said what she always said, what she had been saying since November in different phrasings, all arriving at the same destination. "Your father is dead, Della. You cannot bring him back by staying on that farm." "I am not trying to bring him back," Della said. "I am trying to finish what he started." And what did he start? A better machine, Mama. Eleanor sighed the long exhale of a woman who loved her husband and loved her daughter. and could not understand either of them. She could not comprehend the pull a workshop and a set of tools and a sheet of drafting paper could exert on a human soul. Della hung up the phone. She walked back to the workshop. She stood in front of the blueprint and she began to plan. 6 months later, she bought the Continental at Fort McCoy. 6 months after that, she bought the Engineless Farmall at the Kirchner auction. The plan was complete. The pieces were assembled. The Continental and the Farmall did not fit each other. Of course they did not. No two machines designed by different companies in different factories for different purposes in different decades were ever meant to share a frame. The engine mounts were different. The bell housing bolt pattern was different. The crankshaft flange diameter was different. The cooling system, the fuel system, the electrical system, the exhaust routing, the air intake, the oil filtration. Nothing matched. Every connection point between the Continental and the Farmall was a mismatch. Every bolt hole was in the wrong place. Every dimension was off by just enough to make the installation impossible by any conventional method. A dealer would have looked at the two pieces sitting in that workshop and said, "It could not be done. Go buy a tractor that runs." A factory engineer would have run the compatibility specifications and reached the same conclusion. The bolt patterns do not align. The tolerances are incompatible. The project is, by any reasonable engineering standard, impossible. Della did not operate by reasonable engineering standards. She operated by thousandths of an inch and the knowledge her father had spent a lifetime teaching her. She had the blueprint. She had the tools. She had the dimensions. She had the engine. She had the frame. The first week of May, she rolled the Farmall into the shop and parked it on the bay where Otto's 1934 home-built tractor had been assembled 33 years earlier. She set up the Continental on a heavy steel stand against the east wall. She walked between the two machines for a long time, measuring sketching notes on the back of a calendar page, building the sequence of operations in her head before she ever picked up a wrench. That was the way Otto had taught her to begin. Never start by cutting. Start by seeing. Cutting is what happens after you have seen everything that needs to happen. The metal does not forgive haste. The metal forgives only the cuts that were correctly planned before the chip ever came off. By the second week of May, she was at the milling machine beginning the adapter plate. A late frost came through the second week as well. The corn she had planted on the 1st of May was still safe beneath the soil. The kernels not yet germinated, but the windows of the house grew white at the edges in the mornings, and the workshop was cold enough at 5 a.m. that her breath showed in the air when she opened the door. She fed the wood stove in the corner of the shop with oak splits she had cut and stacked the previous autumn. The stove threw enough heat across the building to keep the temperature above 45 degrees, which was warm enough to work if you wore insulated coveralls and fingerless gloves. You could not feel a micrometer through thick gloves, and in machining feel was everything. Boyd Kreger came by on a Tuesday afternoon, second week of May. He drove his old Ford pickup up the drive and parked it next to the workshop and got out without slamming the door because Boyd Kreger did not slam things. He was 40 years old, lean, quiet, with the kind of face that did not give away what he was thinking. He had farmed the 180 acres directly east of the Holden ground since he was 22. His grandfather had cleared that land from oak brush in the 1930s. He had helped Della fix her east fence the winter Otto died 4 hours in the cold, driving cedar posts into frozen ground, and he had never asked for anything in return. And Della had never forgotten. He walked into the shop with his hat in his hand. He looked at the Farmall. He looked at the Continental on the stand. He looked at the blueprint pinned above the milling machine. He did not say anything for a full minute. "That is going to work," he said finally. It is the only thing he said about the project that day. Then he asked if she needed help moving anything. She said no. He nodded once. He put his hat back on. He left. Della stood in the doorway of the shop and watched his truck pull out onto the road and head east toward his own place. The afternoon sun was on the workshop wall, lighting up the red side of the Farmall, lighting up the olive drab side of the Continental, lighting up the blueprint that her father had drawn before he died. She closed the door. She walked back to the milling machine. She picked up the steel plate she had cut on the bandsaw that morning, a 1-inch slab of hot-rolled steel from a supply house in Stevens Point, and she clamped it to the table of the Bridgeport. She set up the fly cutter. She started the spindle. The mill began its slow song, the steady ringing of carbide on steel, the curling blue chips falling into the chip pan with a sound like tiny bells. Della Holden, 29 years old, alone in her dead father's workshop on a sandy farm. 1,000 men had said she should sell. Began to cut the first piece of a machine her father had drawn but never built. But the letter came on the 8th of May. It came in the regular mail in a long white envelope with the return address of the Adams County Farmers Bank, printed in blue ink in the upper left corner. And it sat in Della Holden's mailbox at the end of the drive for most of an afternoon before she walked down to collect it. The mailman had left it on top of a seed catalog and an electric bill, and the warm spring wind had lifted the corner of the envelope and dropped it again, and lifted it and dropped it. The way wind plays with the things people send each other without knowing what they are sending. She carried the mail back to the house. She set the catalog and the bill on the kitchen table. She opened the bank envelope standing by the sink with the afternoon sun coming in through the window, and she read what was inside. And after a moment, she set the letter down on the drain board very carefully, the way a person sets down something hot. And she walked into the workshop without taking off her boots and stood in front of the blueprint and looked at it for a long time without seeing it. The letter was from a man named Carter Whitfield, who had been the loan officer at the Adams County Farmers Bank for 19 years. Mr. Whitfield had been a friend of Otto Holden in the limited way that bankmen are friends with the farmers whose papers they carry. And he had attended Otto's funeral in November of '65, and he had written Della a personal note at that time, expressing his condolences and assuring her that the bank would be patient with her in the year ahead. Della had appreciated the note. She had kept it in the kitchen drawer. The letter she was holding now was not a personal note. It was the bank's letterhead and the bank's voice, and it was telling her something she had not known. In June of 1963, Otto Holden had mortgaged the workshop and the buildings of the home place against a loan of $5,200 taken out for the purpose of purchasing 20 additional acres of pasture ground on the north end of the property from a neighbor named Hinkle, who was selling out and moving to Florida. Otto had paid the loan down to $4,200 over the next 2 years. He had been making the quarterly interest and a small principal payment when he died. After Otto's death, Della had assumed the surviving farm debt, and the bank had carried her at interest only through 1966, which she had paid on time every quarter. The bank's board had reviewed the loan in their April meeting. The board had decided that interest only was no longer acceptable for an account of this duration. The full balance of $4,200 principal plus accrued interest was due in one payment on or before April 1st, 1968. If the payment was not made, the bank would foreclose on the buildings of the home place, the workshop included. The land would be sold at auction. The proceeds would be applied to the debt. Any surplus would be returned to her. Any shortfall the bank trusted would be made good by the sale of personal property. The letter was signed by Carter Whitfield. There was a postscript in Mr. Whitfield's own handwriting at the bottom, 4 short lines added in blue ink. Della. I argued against this in the board meeting. The decision was 4-2. I am sorry. Call me if there is any way I can help, but I want to be honest with you. There is not. Della stood in the workshop for 10 minutes. She did not move. The blueprint hung on the wall above the mill. The Farmall sat on its stand in the bay. The Continental waited on the steel rack against the east wall. Outside, the afternoon was warm and bright, and the maple tree by the corner of the shop was just coming into leaf, the small green starts on the branches catching the sun. Inside, the shop smelled of cutting oil and wood smoke from the morning's small fire, and the silence was the same silence Otto Holden had left behind in November of 1965. The silence that had filled this room ever since. 11 months, April 1st, 1968. $4,200 she did not have and could not borrow and could not earn from 140 acres of sandy ground without a working tractor. 11 months to finish the machine. 11 months to bring in a crop. 11 months to prove to a board of bank directors in a town meeting room that a woman alone could be trusted with the iron her father had left her. She did not cry. She walked over to the workbench. She picked up the calendar that hung on the wall beside the milling machine, a free promotional calendar from the Stevens Point Steel Supply House, with a picture of a deer in the woods at the top. And she took a red pencil from the cup of pencils on the bench and she circled the 1st of April with a single firm stroke. Then she walked back to the mill and she went back to the cut she had been making before the mail came. The adapter plate took her 3 weeks. The plate was the keystone of the entire conversion. A single piece of steel 1 inch thick that would bolt to the Farmall transmission bell housing on one side and mate to the Continental diesel on the other. It had to speak 2 mechanical languages at once, translating between an American farm tractor from 1952 and a military industrial engine from 1961, making them think they had been designed for each other, when in fact they had never met. The tolerances were extraordinary. The pilot bore the central hole through which the transmission input shaft would pass had to be concentric with the engine crankshaft to within 0.5 of an inch. 0.5. The thickness of a sheet of newspaper, divided by 10. If the bore was off by more than that, the crankshaft and the input shaft would not be aligned. The bearings would load unevenly. The vibration would build season after season until something cracked or seized or shook itself free at the worst possible moment. The bolt holes had to match 2 different patterns. The Continental bell housing used a metric bolt circle from its German-influenced industrial heritage. The Farmall transmission case used an SAE pattern from American standards. The holes in the plate had to accommodate both positioned, so the plate could be bolted to the Farmall with 1 set of fasteners and to the Continental with another, each set tight, each set carrying its share of the load without interference. She squared the faces first, clamping the rough disc to the mill table, running a fly cutter across the surface, removing a few thousandths per pass. After each pass, she unclamped the plate, set it on the surface plate, and swept a dial indicator across the machine face, watching the needle for any deviation. When one side was flat, she flipped the plate and repeated the process on the other side. Then she began boring the pilot hole. She started with a center drill to establish the exact location. She checked the position with the dial indicator. She adjusted the table by 0.5 and checked again. Then she began drilling. She worked up through progressively larger drill bits, each one removing more material, and getting closer to the final dimension until she reached the point where the drill bits were too large for the precision required. Then she switched to a boring bar, a single-point cutting tool that removed metal in increments of 0.02 per pass. Each pass checked with a bore gauge before the next cut. She measured constantly. Micrometer for outside dimensions, bore gauge for the pilot hole, dial indicator for concentricity and flatness, surface plate for reference. She checked and rechecked every dimension against the numbers on Otto's blueprint and against the measurements she had taken herself from both the Continental bell housing and the Farmall transmission case measurements she had recorded in a notebook with the same precision her father had used. 3 weeks of evenings, 3 weeks of weekends. 3 weeks of standing at the Bridgeport with the wood stove going behind her, and the cold steel smell of cutting oil in her hair and her clothes. The corn was in by the end of May, 80 acres planted on the rotation. Otto had worked out in 1958, the rows running east to west to catch the wind across the sand. The cattle were on grass on the north pasture. The 20 acres her father had mortgaged the workshop to buy in 1963. The hay was coming up in the south. The farm did not stop because she was building a tractor. The farm continued. The garden continued. The fences continued. The work she had to do to keep 140 acres alive continued. And the project in the workshop happened in the cracks of that other work. The evening hours, the weekend mornings, the rainy afternoons when field work was impossible. Harlan Beckwith drove by on Sundays. He did not stop. He drove by slowly in the Cadillac, and he looked across the property line at the workshop with the lights on. And he sometimes nodded to himself as if confirming a private theory. On the second Sunday in June, he had stopped at the road end of the Holden Drive and gotten out of the car and stood there for 2 minutes, looking down the long lane toward the buildings, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable from a distance. Della had seen him from the kitchen window. She had not gone out. He had gotten back in the car and driven on, and on Wednesday morning at the co-op breakfast he had repeated his prediction to a slightly larger audience. April 1st. Mark it on your calendar. The Holden girl will be out of that workshop and the bank will own the buildings. You have my word on it. On a Thursday evening in late June, Della finished the final boring pass on the pilot hole and ran the dial indicator one last time. The needle did not move. Dead center. She checked the bolt hole positions against both patterns, Continental and Farmall. Every hole was within 0.5 of its specified location. She laid the plate on the surface plate and swept the indicator across both faces. Less than 1/1000th of deviation across the full diameter. She ran her fingertips across the machine surface. The steel was smooth as still water. She could feel her father in the precision of it, in the way the metal had yielded exactly the way it was supposed to yield, because she had cut it exactly the way it was supposed to be cut. She set the plate on the workbench and allowed herself a single moment of satisfaction. One deep breath. One look at the blueprint on the wall. Then she moved on to the next problem. July was the flywheel adapter. The Continental crankshaft flange was smaller in diameter than the bore of the Farmall flywheel. She machined a stepped collar from a solid billet of 4140 chrome molybdenum steel, a high-strength alloy that could withstand the torsional stresses of a diesel without fatiguing over thousands of hours. The collar bolted to the Continental crankshaft flange on one end and presented the correct diameter and bolt pattern for the Farmall flywheel and clutch assembly on the other. A precision coupling, a mechanical handshake between two machines that had never been introduced. Balanced to within a fraction of an ounce on her father's old balancing fixture, the modified wheel balancer he had built for heavy truck work in 1953. The flywheel spun clean on the dial indicator. The needle did not move. August was the engine mounts, the exhaust manifold, the fuel system. The cooling system rebuilt with a heavy radiator she had pulled from a wrecked international truck at a yard in Marshfield. The wiring harness, every connection soldered with rosin core, every junction wrapped in rubber tape, every wire routed through protective loom along the frame rails where heat and abrasion could not reach them. The shop ran late every night now. The sun went down at 8:30. The fluorescent lights came on. Della worked until 11, sometimes midnight. The way Otto had worked through long Wisconsin summer nights. The way you work when the work has a deadline you cannot push past. And the deadline is not the deadline of a customer, but the deadline of a bank. And the bank does not negotiate. On the 18th of August, she connected the last of the injector lines. She double-checked the fuel system for leaks. She primed the lift pump until diesel wept from the bleeder valves. She bled the air out of every line. She filled the cooling system with a mixture of water and ethylene glycol. She checked the oil level, the belt tensions, the battery connections, the coolant hoses, the fuel filter housings. She went through a checklist. She had written herself 47 items long, each one verified with a pencil check mark on a sheet of notebook paper. She put the checklist on the workbench beside the blueprint. The next evening, the 19th of August, a Saturday with the last orange light of the long Wisconsin summer, slanting in through the west windows of the shop, Della Holden climbed onto the seat of the Farmall Super M and turned the key. The glow plug indicator light came on. The amber glow on the dashboard meant the heating elements in the combustion chambers were warming the air inside the cylinders, preparing for the compression ignition that would follow. She waited 15 seconds. The light went out. She pressed the starter button. The Continental turned over. The starter motor strained against the compression of 4 cylinders, squeezing air to ignition temperature once. The engine rocked on its mounts twice. She could feel the compression pulses through the seat, through the frame, through the steel bones of the machine. On the 3rd revolution, the number 1 cylinder fired. The sound was a deep percussive thud, more felt than heard, a shockwave that traveled through the frame and into the ground. Then number 3 fired, then 2 and 4 together, and the engine caught. For 3 seconds, the workshop filled with the deep, rolling, unmistakable sound of a diesel engine running. The sound Della had been imagining for months. The sound Otto Holden had drawn on paper but never heard. Then the vibration started, not the gentle tremor of an engine at idle. This was something else, a hard, rhythmic shaking that came through the frame rails and into the floor and rattled the wrenches on the pegboard wall 10 feet away. The whole tractor rocked on its tires. The Continental was running, but it was running wrong, and the wrongness was mechanical, structural, deep. Della killed the ignition. The engine sputtered and died. The workshop went silent. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, because in the silence Della could hear what the vibration meant. Something was misaligned. Something she had built was not right. Something she had spent 4 months of evenings and weekends creating, measuring, checking, and believing in was wrong. She climbed down from the seat. She pulled the inspection cover off the bell housing. She mounted a dial indicator on a magnetic base, attached it to the transmission case, and touched the probe to the adapter plate pilot bore. Then she rotated the crankshaft by hand, slowly watching the indicator needle. The needle moved. 2 thousandths, then 3. The pilot bore was not concentric with the transmission input shaft. She had checked it. She had measured it 6 times on the bench. It had been perfect. Dead center. 1/2 thousandth of deviation. She had the measurements in her notebook to prove it. The plate had been perfect on the bench. But when she had bolted it to the bell housing under load with the 400-pound weight of the Continental hanging on it with the bolts torqued to specification, the plate had moved. The mounting bolts had pulled one side of the plate tighter than the other. The steel had flexed imperceptibly 1/1000th of an inch at one edge, and that 1/1000th had propagated through the rotating assembly, amplified by the spinning mass of the flywheel, until the whole drivetrain was vibrating with a force that would destroy bearings and crack castings within a season. 3 weeks of work on the adapter plate. 4 months of work on the complete installation. One mistake, not in the machining, in the assembly sequence, in the torque pattern of the mounting bolts. And the project was a failure. She sat down on the shop floor with her back against the Farmall's left rear tire. The concrete was cold. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead indifferent. She sat there until the cold came through her coveralls. She thought about the bank letter. She thought about Carter Whitfield's blue ink postscript. She thought about Eleanor in Wisconsin Rapids, who would say, "I told you so," without using those exact words. She thought about Harlan Beckwith driving by on Sundays. She thought about Otto Holden lying on this same concrete in November of 1965 with a wrench in his hand. She covered the Farmall with a canvas tarp. She turned off the lights. She walked across the yard to the house in the August dark, and she did not go back to the workshop for 3 days. She did not eat much in those 3 days. She drank coffee. She fed the cattle in the morning and checked the corn in the evening. And the rest of the time she sat in the kitchen chair her father used to sit in and stared at the wall. She did not cry. The tears were inside her somewhere, but they would not come out. They sat behind her eyes the way water sits in a frozen pipe present, but not flowing. On Monday evening, Eleanor called. The phone rang on the wall above the kitchen table, and Della answered it on the 4th ring, because she had not been answering it on the first 3 rings since Otto died, and Eleanor had given up correcting her on it. Eleanor's voice was the same Sunday voice she used every Sunday, even though it was Monday now. "How are you, Della? The corn looks good from the road, I hear. Have you thought any more about coming up to Wisconsin Rapids for a weekend?" Della said the corn was fine. The cattle were fine. She was fine, Eleanor said. "Boyd Kreger called me on Saturday. He said your shop was dark all weekend." Della did not answer that, Eleanor said. "Della, the Hinkle boy is back in town. He has been asking around. He wants to buy the home place. He has a good offer." Della set the receiver down on the kitchen table without hanging up. She walked into the living room and stood by the front window and looked out across the dark yard toward the workshop. The Hinkle boy was a 34-year-old real estate speculator from Madison who had grown up in Adams County and now wore a tie and drove a Lincoln and bought farmland from widows and made his living renting it back to the cousins of the women he had bought it from. Della had met him twice. She had not liked him either time. After a while, she walked back to the kitchen and picked up the receiver. Eleanor was still on the line. She had been talking the whole time. "I have to go," Mama Della said. The cattle. It was not yet sundown. The cattle were not waiting for anything. Eleanor knew that. Eleanor said all right, and they said goodbye. And Della hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen with her hand on the receiver for a long minute before she let go. Walt Drescher arrived on Wednesday morning, the 23rd of August. He arrived at 9 in the morning in his old green Chevrolet pickup, the truck that everyone in Adams County recognized because Walt had owned it since 1953, and the green paint had faded to the color of old grass, and the bed had been welded back together so many times it was more weld than steel. Walt was 71 years old. He was a retired tool and die maker. He had worked at a precision shop in Wausau for 40 years making injection molds and stamping dies for manufacturers across the Midwest. He had moved back to Adams County after retirement to be near his daughter and her family. He had been Otto Holden's closest friend for 22 years. The kind of friendship machinists share, built on mutual respect and a mutual inability to explain their work to anyone outside the trade. He had attended Otto's funeral. He had stood at the back of the church and not said much, the way machinists do not say much, and afterward he had shaken Della's hand and held it for a moment longer than necessary. And that had been a kind of speech in itself. He had called Della on the 1st of August and asked if he could come by on the 23rd to look at the 3-point hitch on her old Ford tractor, which had been giving her trouble in June. She had said yes, that would be fine. They had set a date. The date was today. Walt did not know when he pulled into the drive what had happened in the workshop on Saturday evening, or what had happened in the kitchen during the 3 days afterward. He had come to look at a 3-point hitch. He parked the truck. He got out. He saw that the workshop door was closed and there was no light coming through the windows on a clear Wednesday morning. He walked to the house and knocked on the kitchen door. Della opened the door. Her hair was unwashed. Her eyes had the dull red of 3 nights without sleep. The canvas jacket was hanging on its peg by the door, but she had not put it on. Walt looked at her. He did not say anything for 10 seconds. Then he said, "Your father had that exact face in 1957. He stepped past her into the kitchen and set his hat on the kitchen table. He sat down in the chair across from where she had been sitting. He nodded at the chair she had vacated. She sat. He said, "I promised your father in 1962 that if anything happened to him, I would not let you stand alone on this place. I have been a poor friend in waiting this long. I should have come sooner. But your father said you needed time to find your own footing before anyone reached for your elbow. And I respected his judgment, and I waited. I am not waiting anymore. Put on your coat. We are going to the shop." She did not move. She said the plate shifted under bolt load. He nodded. 2000ths. How did you know? I have been looking at that tractor through your kitchen window for 3 days. I can see the inspection cover is off the bell housing. I can see the dial indicator still clamped on it. I know what that setup means. Uneven torque on the mounting bolts. Tell me I am wrong. You are not wrong." He nodded once. He stood up. He picked up his hat. "Get your coat, Della." She got her coat. They walked across the yard in the August light. The corn was tall now. The cicadas were noisy in the trees along the drive. The maple tree by the corner of the workshop was full and green. Walt opened the workshop door. He turned on the fluorescent lights. He walked over to the Farmall and pulled the canvas tarp off it and folded the tarp, the way machinists fold canvas in halves and quarters and eighths, until it was a tight rectangle he set on the workbench. He stood in front of the tractor with his hands behind his back, and he looked at the engine bay for a long time. Then he turned to Della. He said, "Your father had this exact problem in 1957. He was building a PTO adapter for the Ford tractor over there. Same situation exactly. Perfect on the bench. Out of specification, under load. He spent 2 weeks trying to understand what happened. It made him furious. You know how he was. Otto could tolerate a lot of things, but he could not stand a mistake he could not explain." Della was very still. "I never told you this," Walt said. "Otto never told you this either." He was ashamed of it. He kept it to himself for the rest of his life, and the only reason I know it is that he told me in this shop on a Tuesday evening in October of 1957 with a bottle of beer in his hand, and the same face you have now. He was 54 years old then. He had been a machinist for 40 years, and he had made a mistake he could not at first understand, and it had made him doubt everything he had ever done. Della's hands were trembling. She put them in her pockets. Walt walked over to the blueprint on the wall. He touched the corner of it gently, the way an old man touches a thing that means something he cannot quite say. He turned back to her. He said, "The blueprint on this wall is the last page of a long story. The pages before it are full of errors and corrections and problems your father solved by refusing to quit. That is what makes a machinist, Della. Not the successes, the recoveries. Your father was great because he made mistakes and figured out why. He was great because he gave himself permission to be wrong, and then he insisted on being right the second time. He was not a man who never failed. He was a man who could not stop trying. And you, Della Holden, are the only person on this earth who knows enough to finish the thing he started. You are the only one. There is no one else. And you cannot finish it if you do not allow yourself the right to have built a plate that shifted under bolt load. She turned her face away from him because the tears were finally coming. He did not look at her while she cried. He turned back to the Farmall and pretended to study the engine. He let her have the moment to herself. He was a man who understood when not to look. After a while, she said, "What did he do?" In 1957, Walt did not turn around. He said, he pulled the plate. He remachined the bolt holes with a slight interference fit, 3/1000ths oversize, so the bolts would preload the plate against shifting when they were torqued. And he torqued them in a star pattern opposite corners first, working inward with a calibrated wrench, so every bolt carried exactly the same load. The interference fit held the plate in position. The star pattern distributed the clamping force evenly. He made a torque sequence diagram and taped it to the wall so he would never make the same mistake twice. The diagram was on this same wall for 3 years before he took it down. I do not know why he took it down. Maybe he was tired of looking at it, but it worked. The Ford ran for the next 8 years on that adapter. It is still running, sitting right over there. He turned around then. He looked at her. He said, "Now you know what your father did. The question is what you are going to do." She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. She looked at the Farmall. She looked at the blueprint. She looked at Walt Drescher, 71 years old, standing in her father's workshop with his hands behind his back, waiting for her answer. She said, "I am going to remachine the bolt holes with an interference fit. I am going to make a torque sequence diagram. I am going to do what he did." Walt nodded. He picked up his hat from the workbench. He said, "I will come back on Saturday morning at 8. I'm going to help you pull the engine off the plate so you can take it back to the mill. I am old and I am slow, but I can still tighten a chain hoist and I can still hold a wrench. We will get this thing running before the corn comes off." He walked out of the shop. She heard his truck start. She heard him drive down the lane to the road and turn east toward his daughter's place. She walked over to the workbench. She picked up the calendar with the red circle on the 1st of April. She set it aside. She picked up a clean sheet of notebook paper from the drawer. With a sharpened pencil, she began to draw on that fresh sheet the torque sequence diagram. Bolt number 1, bolt number 2. The star pattern Otto Holden had used in 1957. The torque values, the order of application. The wrench calibration she would verify before she began. When she was finished, she taped the diagram to the wall next to her father's blueprint. 2 pieces of paper on the wall now. One from the father who designed the machine. One from the daughter who would build it and would not make the same mistake twice. The correction took 2 weeks. The lesson lasted forever. Walt came back on Saturday morning as promised. They pulled the Continental off the adapter plate using the chain hoist Otto had installed in 1953. They unbolted the plate. Della carried it back to the milling machine. Walt sat on the wooden stool by the workbench, his bad knee straight out in front of him, and he watched her work. And he did not give advice unless she asked for it. And she asked for it twice in 2 weeks. And both times he was right. And both times she nodded and did exactly what he said. She opened each bolt hole by 3/1000ths in a carefully calculated pattern that would create an interference fit when the bolts were installed, preloading the plate against lateral movement in any direction. She reinstalled the plate on a Saturday in early September. She torqued each bolt in the sequence she had designed, checking the pilot bore concentricity with the dial indicator after every bolt was tightened. The needle did not move. Not a thousandth. Not half a thousandth. The plate was locked, preloaded, concentric, immovable. She started the Continental on the 12th of September at 6 in the evening, with Walt Drescher standing in the workshop doorway with his hat in his hand and the late summer sun behind him. The engine caught on the second crank. It settled into the deep, staid idle of a diesel at operating temperature. No vibration, no rattle. The wrenches on the pegboard wall hung quiet. The frame did not move. The shop floor did not shake. Walt did not say anything. He nodded once. He put on his hat. He walked out to his truck and drove home. Della shut the engine off. She sat on the seat for a long time in the silence after listening to the cooling metal tick, the way machinery ticks when it has just done what it was built to do. Then she got down. She walked to the workbench. She picked up the calendar with the red circle on it. She moved the calendar to a different nail higher up, where she would have to look up to see it. She wanted to look up. The corn came off in October. 82 bushels an acre on the 80 acres. She sold the crop to the co-op elevator, and she paid the interest on the banknote and the property taxes in the seed bill. And what was left was not enough to make a payment on principal. She had known that going in. The Continental conversion was not yet earning. The neighbors did not yet know it ran. Harlan Beckwith was still telling the co-op breakfast every Wednesday morning what would happen on April 1st. Della began to work all the long hours of October and November and December on the things that would let the tractor be a real tractor. The hydraulic pump rebuild. The exhaust manifold she fabricated from heavy wall steel tubing. The oil filter adapter she machined from aluminum, because the Continental took a different filter than the Farmall, and no commercial adapter existed. The new seat cushion she sewed herself from canvas and horse blanket, because the original had rotted in the fence row. By the second week of January, she had a finished machine, a diesel Farmall Super M with all systems in place, and all systems tested, parked in the workshop bay waiting for the spring fieldwork that would prove it. Then the cold came. The cold came on the 15th of January, 1968, in the form of a high-pressure system that had built up over Hudson Bay in northern Canada and had drifted south, the way those systems drift into the upper Midwest. The temperature in Adams County fell to 10 below zero on the 15th, to 18 below on the 16th, to 24 below on the 17th, to 31 below by Friday the 19th. And there it stayed between 28 below and 34 below for 13 straight days. Wisconsin had not seen a cold like that since 1936. The old men at the co-op stopped going to the co-op because the trucks would not start. Storm doors froze shut. Water pipes burst in farmhouses across the county. The Adams County School District closed for 11 days. Cattle stood with their heads down in the wind in barnyards across 3 townships, breathing into their own chests for warmth, their eyelashes white with frost. And every modern tractor in Adams County stopped. The new John Deere 4020s that Harlan Beckwith had sold to 37 farmers in the last 4 years would not turn over. The gasoline in their tanks had lost its volatility. The motor oil in their crankcases had thickened to the consistency of cold honey. The batteries had drained themselves trying to crank engines that would not catch. Across the county, in shed after shed, men stood in the cold with their hands in their pockets and looked at machines that were supposed to be the modern future of agriculture, and that on the second worst cold snap in 32 years could not move. Boyd Kreger's John Deere was one of them. Boyd had 220 head of beef cattle in the south barn at his place east of the Holden line. The cattle had to be fed twice a day. The hay was stacked in round bales 3/4 of a mile from the barn across the south pasture. Boyd had been hauling hay to the cattle with the John Deere and a long bed wagon since the cold began. On the 27th of January, with the morning temperature at 33 below zero, the John Deere did not start. Boyd tried to hand crank it. The engine would not turn. He tried to jump start it with the truck. The truck would not start either. He put a propane heater under the engine block. The heater ran for 2 hours and lowered the oil temperature to the point where it could turn, but the gasoline in the tank had separated and would not feed, and the engine fired twice and died. By the afternoon of the 27th, the cattle had not been fed for almost a full day. Beef cattle in cold weather burn calories faster than they can be replaced. Without feed, they begin to lose body condition immediately. Within 2 days, they would weaken. Within 5, they would begin to die. Boyd Kreger stood in his yard at 4 in the afternoon in the bitter sub-zero wind, watching his cattle through the rails of the south barn lot. And he understood with the cold clarity of a man who has run out of options that he was going to lose his herd. I went into the house. He sat down at the kitchen table. His wife, Margaret, put a cup of coffee in front of him. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The phone rang. Boyd picked it up. It was Walt Drescher. Walt said, "Boyd, get your hay sled hitched up to the barn door. I have called Della. She is bringing her tractor over. She will be there at 4 in the morning. The cattle will eat tomorrow." Boyd Kreger sat with the phone in his hand. He could not speak for a moment. He cleared his throat. He said, "Walt, that tractor," Walt said. "That tractor has been running for 4 months. I have watched it start on -10 mornings since November. The diesel does not care about your cold snap. The Holden girl knows what she is doing. She is coming. Get the sled hitched up." Boyd hung up the phone. He looked at Margaret. He stood up from the table and reached for his coat. 11 miles south in the workshop on the Holden farm, Della was at the workbench in the dark hour before dawn, checking the glow plug circuit. One last time, charging the heavy-duty starter battery, filling the auxiliary fuel tank with diesel from the drum by the door. The shop temperature was 40 degrees. The outside temperature was 34 below. The wind was out of the northwest at 18 miles an hour. She put on her father's canvas jacket. She put on the insulated coveralls over her work clothes. She wrapped a wool scarf around her face. She climbed onto the seat of the Farmall. She turned the key. The glow plug light came on amber in the dark workshop. She waited 30 seconds longer than usual, because the cold demanded it. The light went out. She pressed the starter button. The Continental cranked. Once, twice. On the third crank it caught, and it caught hard with the deep authority of a military diesel doing what it was built to do, and the workshop filled with the rolling growl of an engine running where no engine in the county was supposed to be running on a morning that cold. She backed the tractor out of the shop into the bitter dark. She closed the shop door. She drove out the lane in the headlights with the snow blowing across the beam, and she turned east on the county road toward Boyd Kreger's place, and the only sound in the cold, dark world for half a mile in any direction was the steady, reliable thunder of a $35 Farmall with an $85 military diesel inside it, doing what a $5,000 John Deere could not do on the coldest morning of the worst winter Adams County had seen in 32 years. Boyd Kreger heard her coming from a mile away. He was standing in his yard, with the hay sled hitched and his lantern in his hand. He saw the headlights at the top of the rise. He watched them come down the long, flat stretch of county road, and as they came closer, he could hear the engine, the deep, slow diesel roll of it, carrying through the cold, dense air. And he took his hat off in his own yard and held it against his chest for a moment before he put it back on, because he was a man of his generation, and there were things you did not do with your hat on and watching the woman who had bought a tin can at an auction 9 months ago come over the hill at 4 in the morning to save your herd was one of them. The headlights turned into the drive. The engine slowed. The big Farmall came to a stop next to the south barn, with its diesel idling, and Della Holden climbed down out of the seat with the wool scarf still wrapped around her face, and Boyd Kreger walked toward her in the snow. He said one thing, only one thing, and he said it quietly because his throat was tight from the cold and from something else. He said, "They were going to die today." Della pulled the scarf down from her face. She looked at Boyd. She looked at the south barn where the cattle were lowing softly in the cold. She looked at the hay sled hitched and ready. She looked east across the dark fields toward the rest of Adams County, where in every dark shed and every cold barnyard, there were other men with other cattle and other tractors that would not start. She said, "Where are the bales?" Boyd pointed across the south pasture toward the stack in the dark. The lantern light caught the steam of his breath. Della climbed back onto the seat. She put the tractor in gear. She started across the snow toward the haystack with Boyd walking beside the tractor and the sled rumbling along behind on the frozen ground and behind her on the eastern horizon. The first thin gray light of the longest day of her life was just beginning to show above the cold black line of the Wisconsin fields. By dawn on the 27th, the cattle were eating. Della and Boyd worked through the gray cold morning without speaking much, the Farmall idling between trips. The sled loaded and loaded again, the round bales rolling off into the south barn lot, where the steers crowded forward with frost on their backs and steam on their breath, and that particular sound cattle make when they have been hungry. And the hay finally comes. Boyd's wife, Margaret, brought coffee out to the yard in a tin pot at 7 o'clock, and the three of them stood in the lee of the barn, drinking it from chipped enamel cups, while the diesel ticked behind them in the cold, and the sun came up red over the eastern fence line. At 8 o'clock, while they were still standing there, the phone rang inside the house. Margaret went in to answer it. She came back out 2 minutes later with her coat half on. She said that was Lyle Vannatta. His herd has not been fed since yesterday morning. His tractor is dead. He heard you were here. Della handed her coffee cup to Margaret. She climbed back onto the seat of the Farmall. Boyd unhitched the empty sled and walked it back behind the barn. Della backed the diesel out of the yard and turned east on the county road toward the Vannatta place 3 miles further on, and Boyd Kreger stood in his own driveway watching the headlights move away in the cold, thin morning air. And he did not say anything to Margaret, because there were no words he had for what was happening, and the only thing in him strong enough to be called a feeling was the simple recognition that the woman the whole county had laughed at 9 months ago was now the only person in 3 townships who could keep their neighbors' cattle alive. She fed Vannatta's cattle by 10. By noon, she was at the Sorensen place on Sorensen's hay sled hauling round bales to a herd of dairy heifers that had not eaten since the day before. By 3 in the afternoon, she was at the Gerke farm, pulling a snowplow through a 1/4 mile of drifted lane so the milk truck could get to the dairy barn. By 6 o'clock, she was at the Mecklenburg place hauling water from the windmill to the cattle tanks, because the line had frozen solid and could not be thawed without power, and the power lines from Friendship had gone down at 3 that afternoon under the weight of the ice that had formed on them through the long, cold week. She went home at 10 that night, the headlights cutting through the wind-blown snow on the empty road, the Farmall's diesel running steady, the heat from the engine rising up under the hood and warming her boots through the firewall. She slept 4 hours. She was up at 3. She fed her own stock by lantern light. She filled the tractor with diesel from the drum. She went out again at 5:30. 3 weeks of that cold, Della Holden fed cattle and hauled water and broke ice and pulled stuck pickup trucks out of drifts and plowed lanes and delivered diesel from her own farm to the neighbors whose fuel barrels had frozen. And by the time the cold broke on the 11th of February, she had served 23 farms across 2 townships, 23 families whose cattle had eaten because of her tractor, 23 men who would have lost herds without her, and who knew it and who would not forget it. Harlan Beckwith disappeared from the co-op breakfast for the whole month of February. The men noticed. No one said anything. There was nothing to say. The story of what Della Holden was doing with the tractor was traveling through the county faster than gossip had any right to move. And Harlan Beckwith, who had built his reputation on his ability to read men and machines, had nothing to add to the conversation. By the second week of March, the snow was beginning to go off the south fields. The bank deadline was 19 days away. April 1st. Della was at the workbench on the evening of the 14th, checking the figures in her account book by the light of the gooseneck lamp. The cattle she had sold in November and the corn she had brought off in October, and the small jobs she had done for the neighbors in the cold weeks had together put $2,400 in her checking account at the Adams County Farmers Bank. The banknote was $4,200 plus the accrued interest which Carter Whitfield had calculated and sent her in a separate statement in early March. The total was $4,418. She was $1,818 short. She closed the account book. She turned off the gooseneck lamp. She walked over to the milling machine and stood in front of it. Otto's Bridgeport, the mill her father had pulled out of a bankrupt shop in Milwaukee in 1949 and rebuilt over the course of a winter, scraping the ways flat, replacing the spindle bearings, restoring the machine to dead accuracy with the patience that only Otto Holden had ever possessed. She had used that mill to build the adapter plate that had kept 23 herds alive. She had used it to do everything she had done since November of 1965. That mattered. She could sell it. The Bridgeport in working order would bring $1,500 from any precision shop in central Wisconsin. The South Bend lathe next to it would bring another $600 from a man who knew what it was. Together they would cover the banknote. Together they would also empty the workshop of the only 2 machines without which the workshop was not a workshop anymore. It would be after that a building with a wood stove in it. She stood in front of the mill for a long time. She did not touch it. She turned off the overhead lights. She walked back to the house in the dark. Walt Drescher came up the lane on Saturday morning, the 23rd of March, 9 days before the deadline. He drove up in the green Chevrolet pickup the same way he had driven up in August, and he parked it in the same spot, and he got out without slamming the door. Della was in the yard splitting kindling for the cook stove. She set the maul down when she heard the truck. Walt walked across the yard to her. He had a manila envelope in his right hand, plain brown, the kind you got at the drugstore in Friendship for 15 cents. He did not say anything as he walked. He stopped in front of her. He held out the envelope. She did not take it. She looked at his face. Walt said, "Boyd Kreger called me 3 weeks ago. He had been thinking about something since the morning you brought the tractor over to feed his cattle. He had been thinking about it through the rest of the cold and then through the thaw. He came to me because I am old, and people listen to me when I tell them what to do. He asked me to do something. I said yes. I have spent the last 3 weeks driving from farm to farm, 23 farms, sometimes 2 in one day. I told every man I visited what I was there for. I did not ask any of them to give. I told them what the bank had done, and I told them what their cattle were worth that they would not be worth without your tractor. And I left it at that. Every farm I went to, I came home with money in this envelope. Cash. They did not want it on paper. They did not want it called what it was. They said to call it a tractor bill. They said you had not been paid for the work you did in January, and that was overdue. And a tractor bill is what a man pays after he has used a tractor. He held the envelope out further toward her. She still did not take it. Walt said, 23 men, Della. $1,812. It is $6 short of what you need. The $6 I am putting in myself because I have not paid you for the work you did, clearing my drive on the 7th of February, and that was overdue too. Della took the envelope. She held it in both hands. She did not open it. She looked down at the brown paper, and her hands were shaking. Walt said, "They are not calling it a gift. Do not call it that either. They are calling it a bill they owed. Some of them got real angry that they had to do it this way because they wanted to give you more, and you would not have taken more. So we did the math on what they would have paid a custom operator for the same work. And we figured the hours, and we figured the diesel, and we figured a fair labor rate. Some of them rounded up. Some of them did not. The number came out close enough to what you needed that we knew it was the right number. That is all. That is the whole story." She tried to say thank you. The words would not come. She looked at Walt, and her eyes filled, and she nodded once, and Walt nodded back. And then he turned around and got into his truck and drove down the lane and did not look back, because he was a man who understood when not to look. She paid the banknote on Monday the 25th. She walked into the Adams County Farmers Bank in Friendship at 9 in the morning in the canvas jacket and clean work pants. And she stood at the loan officer's desk, and she counted out $4,418 in cash from the manila envelope onto Carter Whitfield's desk. And Carter Whitfield watched her count it without saying anything until she was done. Then he counted it again himself. He filled out the receipt. He pushed the receipt across the desk to her. He said, "Della, there are not many days in this job that I get to do this. I want you to know that today is one of them." She put the receipt in the inside pocket of the jacket. She shook his hand. She walked out of the bank into the spring sun on the main street of Friendship. 5 days later, on the morning of the 30th of March, with the south fields finally dry enough to work, Della hitched the 4-bottom John Deere plow her father had bought used in 1954 behind the diesel Farmall, drove the tractor out the lane, and turned south on the county road and pulled into the gateway of her south field, the field that faced the road, the field that every neighbor driving past could see. She lowered the plow into the sandy ground. She opened the throttle. The original Farmall Super M with its factory gasoline engine could pull a 3-bottom plow through Adams County sand without lugging down. 3 bottoms was the practical limit. Every farmer in the county knew it. You could hook up a 4th bottom, but the engine would labor and slow and overheat, and you would spend more time nursing the tractor than plowing the field. The Continental diesel pulled all 4 bottoms through the sand like it was running downhill. The engine did not strain. The RPM did not drop. The exhaust note deepened slightly under load, the way a diesel deepens when it is working. But there was no labor in it, no struggle. The torque curve of the CD193, broad and flat and relentless, put power to the ground at exactly the speed and force the soil required. The sandy ground that grabbed at plow bottoms and bogged down gasoline engines was no match for the diesel. Word traveled across the county before noon. By 2 in the afternoon, there were 11 trucks parked along the fence line of the south field. By 4 o'clock, there were 19. Men in overalls and men in town coats. Men with their hands in their pockets and their hats pushed back. The Sorensen brothers, Lyle Van Atta, Boyd Kreger, and his oldest boy, Jeremiah, who was 3 years old and sat on his father's shoulders to see better. The Mecklenburg cousins. Carter Whitfield drove out from the bank on his lunch hour and stayed until 3:30. Walt Drescher sat in the cab of his Chevrolet pickup at the road end of the field with the window down and a thermos of coffee on the dash, and watched the whole thing without getting out, because his knees were bad and the standing was hard, and he had earned the right to watch from his own truck. Harlan Beckwith was the last to arrive. He drove out from Friendship in the Cadillac at 4:15. He parked behind the line of pickup trucks. He got out. He walked along the fence line slowly with his hands in the pockets of his town coat and his hat low against the wind. And he stood at the corner of the field and watched Della Holden pull 4 bottoms of plow through Adams County sand with a tractor that he had told 23 men at a co-op breakfast would be scrapped by Christmas. He watched for 20 minutes. He did not speak to anyone. Then he got back in the Cadillac and he drove away. The next Wednesday morning, Harlan Beckwith walked into the co-op breakfast at 7 o'clock. The men were at the long table by the window the way they were every Wednesday. 23 farmers and the parts manager and the seed dealer. Boyd Kreger at the end near the window. Lyle Van Natta in the middle. The Sorensen brothers across from him. Carter Whitfield sitting in a chair he did not usually sit in, because Carter Whitfield had heard the way everyone in town had heard that Harlan Beckwith was coming to the breakfast that day, and Carter Whitfield wanted to be there. Harlan walked the length of the table. He did not sit down. He took off his hat and held it in his hands the way men in his generation held their hats when they were about to do something difficult. He looked at the men at the table. He said, "On the 2nd Wednesday of April last year in this room at this table, I put my reputation on it, that the Holden girl would be out of her workshop by the 1st of April this year and that the bank would own the buildings. I was wrong. I am here this morning to say so in front of every man who heard me say it the first time. I was wrong about her tractor. I was wrong about her work. I was wrong about what one person can build alone in a workshop with the right tools and the right knowledge and the right reason for being in there. I've been selling farm equipment in this county for 20 years. I should have known better. The truth is, I did know better. And I said what I said anyway because I was sure of myself. And being sure of myself was easier than thinking carefully about a person who did not happen to come into my showroom. I owe Della Holden an apology I am not able to deliver in person, because I have not yet earned the right to face her. I am delivering it to you instead. I am asking you to understand that I have heard what every man here has been not saying to me for the last 4 weeks, and I want you to know that I have heard it correctly, and I am ashamed." He put his hat back on. He turned around. He walked out of the co-op. The men at the table did not say anything for a long time. Boyd Kreger looked down at his coffee. Carter Whitfield looked out the window. The parts manager poured another round of coffee from the pot in the middle of the table, and the morning resumed. And nobody ever asked Harlan Beckwith to repeat what he had said, because asking him to repeat it would have undone the cost of his having said it the first time. And Adams County understood that kind of accounting. The diesel Farmall became the center of Della Holden's farming operation, and it never relinquished the position. The Continentals started every morning, winter and summer, with the reliability of a machine that had been designed for military service. In January at 20 below zero, when other tractors sat cold and dead, the Farmall fired on the second crank and settled into its deep authoritative idle. It burned a third less fuel than the gasoline tractors on neighboring farms. It pulled harder at low RPM. It ran cooler in summer. It required nothing more than oil changes every 200 hours, filter replacements, and an annual check of the injector timing. The adapter plate held. The flywheel adapter stayed balanced. The engine mounts did not crack. Everything Della had built during the long winter of '67 was still working because everything had been built by a machinist who understood that holding was not a hope, but a specification. In May of 1969, the first conversion job came in. A farmer named Stenstrom from outside Coloma drove out to the Holden place with a 1948 Farmall H on a trailer. He had heard the story. He wanted the same thing on a smaller frame for hay work and garden cultivation. Della told him she would think about it. She thought about it for 2 days. She wrote out the specifications, sized a Perkins 4-cylinder diesel against the smaller transmission case, drew her own adapter plate, and quoted him $300 for the conversion. Parts and labor all in. He brought a check the next week. The Stenstrom conversion ran. The neighbors heard. By the end of 1970, she had done 4 more. By 1973, she had a list of 14 conversions waiting and was turning new work away because she could only do 6 in a year while still running her own farming operation. She bought a second milling machine, a smaller Bridgeport she found at an auction in Stevens Point, and she set it up on the east wall of the workshop next to her father's machine. She kept the rates the same, $200 to $400 per conversion, parts and labor. The farmers brought their own frames. She sourced the engines from military surplus sales at Fort McCoy and from industrial auctions across Wisconsin and Minnesota. Every plate was custom machined. Every installation was one of a kind. Every single one of them ran. Harlan Beckwith watched his potential customer base shrink one diesel conversion at a time. Farmers who might have bought a used John Deere from his lot were instead paying Della $300 for a machine that worked as well or better. He did not fight it. He had given up the fight on the morning he walked into the co-op without his hat. In 1976, 8 years after the apology, Harlan started doing something that surprised everyone in Adams County, including himself. He started sending customers to Della, farmers who walked into his dealership looking for a used tractor on a tight budget, men who could not afford a new John Deere and did not want to mortgage their land. Harlan would listen to their situation, consider their acreage and their soil type and their operating costs, and then he would say something no equipment dealer in Wisconsin had probably ever said before. "I cannot help you under $3,000. He would say, "There is a woman south of Friendship who can. Name is Della Holden. She will build you a tractor for a fraction of what I would charge. And honestly, it will run better than most of what is on my lot." The arrangement was unusual. The arrangement worked. The men Harlan sent to Della were grateful to Harlan for the referral and grateful to Della for the work. And they remembered when their situations improved, where they had been helped on the day they could not be helped by their first choice. Harlan sold 7 new John Deeres in 1979 to former Della customers who had come back to him with cash. He told no one that this was why he was doing it. He simply did it. Jeremiah Kreger started coming to the shop in the summer of 1976. He was 12 years old. He was Boyd Kreger's oldest son. He had spent the cold mornings of his childhood watching his father feed cattle from a tractor. Della Holden had kept alive, and he had grown up on a farm 220 acres east of her workshop, and he had heard the story of the cold week of January 1968 so many times from his father that the story was part of the air he breathed. He showed up at Della's door one Saturday morning in June of 1976 with a paper sack of his mother's oatmeal cookies and a question. He wanted to know if he could watch. He would not touch anything. He would not be in the way. He just wanted to watch. Della let him watch for 2 Saturdays. On the 3rd Saturday, she handed him a piece of scrap mild steel and showed him how to face it on the smaller Bridgeport. By the end of the summer, Jeremiah Kreger, 12 years old, could read a micrometer to a half-thousandth. By the time he was 16, he could run the lathe. By the time he was 20, he could weld as well as Della could. He came every Saturday he was not in school. and through both summers of high school and after he started at the technical college in Wausau. He came home every other weekend to keep learning. Della never paid him. He never asked for pay. The arrangement was the arrangement Otto Holden had made with her when she was 12 years old. The knowledge had to go somewhere. Knowledge that is not passed down dies with the person who holds it. The corn prices began their long slide in 1980. $3 a bushel that year. $2.75 in 81. $2.10 by 82. Under $2 by 83. Interest rates climbed in parallel. 15%. 16. 18. The Federal Reserve, fighting the inflation that had plagued the American economy for a decade, tightened the money supply until credit became so expensive that borrowing felt like bleeding. Every farmer in the Midwest who carried debt felt the pressure increase with each rate announcement. Della carried no debt. The home place was paid for. The workshop was paid for. The Farmall and the 2 milling machines and the lathe and the welder and the forge were paid for. Her conversion business brought in $20,000 to $30,000 a year in the good years through the 70s, less in the recession years of the early 80s. But always more than her costs, because her costs were her time and her electric bill and the surplus parts she paid pennies on the dollar for. She put away $6,000 a year through the 70s, less in the early 80s. By the spring of 1984, she had $78,000 in the Adams County Farmers Bank, not in stocks, not in speculative investments in a savings account, where Carter Whitfield reviewed the balance every quarter and shook his head in private admiration that he never voiced aloud. Adams County lost 6 farms between 1982 and 1986. Each one was a variation on the same theme: expansion during the boom, confidence that prices would keep rising, and land would keep appreciating and credit would remain cheap. Then the reversal, the phone call from the bank, the meeting in the office with a loan officer who used to smile and now could not make eye contact. The auction. Boyd Kreger had expanded in 1978. He had borrowed $60,000 to buy an additional 60 acres north of his existing property and to finance a new John Deere 4440 from Harlan Beckwith's lot. The decision had made sense in 1978. Corn was $3.50. Credit was 8%. The extension agents and the bankers and the seed dealers were telling farmers to grow. By 1983, the 60 acres were worth less than half of what Boyd had paid for them, and the John Deere was worth maybe $12,000 on a good day, and the interest on both loans had climbed to 18%. He was farming to pay the bank, and the bank was still not satisfied. I went to the bank 3 times in 2 years. Each visit was worse than the last. In the spring of 1984, he was told that the bank was done extending. He had until the end of harvest to bring his accounts current, or the bank would foreclose. He could not bring the accounts current. It was arithmetic, not moral failure. But arithmetic does not distinguish between bad luck and bad character, and neither in the end do banks. The auction was held on a Saturday in the second week of October 1984, one of those Wisconsin autumn days that arrives like an apology for the winter that is coming. Clear and bright and 55 degrees. The trees along the fence rows turning gold and scarlet. The sky a blue so deep it hurt to look at. A beautiful day for anything except what was about to happen. The auctioneer set up his podium in front of the Kreger machine shed. The crowd was larger than most farm auctions because the Kreger place was known to be good land productive despite the sandy soil. Neighbors came out of solidarity and guilt. Equipment dealers came for bargains. Speculators from Milwaukee and Madison came with calculators and cold eyes looking for land they could buy cheap and rent back to the very farmers who had lost it. Boyd stood near the machine shed with his wife Margaret and his 3 sons. Jeremiah was 20. The 2 younger boys were 16 and 14. Boyd was wearing a clean shirt and the face of a man who had done everything within his power and knew it was not enough. Della arrived early. She parked her pickup on the county road and walked in through the crowd without stopping to talk to anyone. She found a spot at the edge of the gathering near the east fence where she could see the auctioneer's podium without being conspicuous. She was wearing the canvas jacket. The checkbook from the Adams County Farmers Bank was in the inside pocket. The equipment sold first. The John Deere 4440 went for $14,000. Boyd had paid $28,000. A disc harrow brought $400. A planter brought $600. A grain cart, $900. The pieces of a working farm separated and scattered sold to the highest bidders carried away on flatbed trucks, each piece a part of Boyd's life that he would not see again. Then the land. The 60-acre parcel, the one Boyd had borrowed to buy in 1978, sold first. A speculator from Milwaukee bought it for $280 an acre. Quick sale, no drama. Boyd watched it go with the expression of a man who had already grieved that piece and moved on to the larger grief waiting behind it. The original 180 acres came last. The home place. The land Boyd's grandfather had cleared from oak brush in the 1930s. The land Boyd's father had farmed through the Depression and the war. The land Boyd had expected to hand to Jeremiah and the 2 younger boys. The way it had been handed to him, a piece of the earth that belonged to a family. The way a name belongs by inheritance and by right. The bank set the opening bid at $200 an acre. The auctioneer called for bids. The speculator from Milwaukee, the same one who had bought the 60 acres, raised his hand. $200. $240, said a voice from the east fence. Every head in the crowd turned. Della Holden, standing by the fence in her father's canvas jacket with one hand raised. The speculator consulted with his partner. They ran numbers on a calculator. $260. $280, Della said. The speculator ran more numbers. $300. $310, Della said. Her voice was steady. She did not hesitate. The speculator looked at his partner. His partner shook his head. At $310 an acre, the projected return on sandy Adams County farmland, rented at current market rates, did not justify the capital outlay for an investment group based in Milwaukee. The speculator dropped his hand. $310. 180 acres. $55,800. The auctioneer asked for the payment method. Della walked from the fence to the auctioneer's table. She took the checkbook from the inside pocket of the jacket. She opened it to the next blank check. She wrote the date. She wrote the amount. $55,800. She signed her name. She tore the check from the book and laid it on the table. Cash. One check. No financing. No partners. No bank loan. One woman. One signature. One farm. The crowd went quiet. There is a particular silence that falls over an auction crowd when money speaks louder than anyone expected. It is the silence of recalculation, the collective revision of every assumption the crowd had carried into the event. Boyd Kreger saw who had bought his farm. He stood still for a long moment. Then he walked toward Della slowly, the way a man walks when his legs are not entirely reliable and his emotions are moving faster than his body can manage. Margaret followed a few steps behind, holding the arm of their youngest son. Jeremiah walked beside his father. Della met them halfway between the podium and the fence. They stood in the October sunlight. 2 farmers. One who had just lost 180 acres, and one who had just bought them. Della spoke first. She spoke the way she did everything directly without decoration. She said, "Boyd, I want you to keep working this land." Boyd stared at her. He opened his mouth and closed it. She said, "I do not need 180 more acres to manage by myself. I need someone who knows this ground. You know it better than anyone alive. Your grandfather cleared it. Your father worked it. You have been on it your whole life. I want you to stay on as a partner, not a hired man. A partner. You manage the fields. We split the crop at harvest. Your family stays in the house. Your boys grow up here." Boyd's eyes were wet. He was a man of his generation, raised to believe that tears were private, and the effort of holding them back was visible in the muscles of his jaw and the set of his shoulders. Margaret stepped forward and put her hand on Boyd's arm. She looked at Della with an expression that contained more gratitude than words could carry. Boyd took Della's hand and shook it. His grip was strong and calloused and unsteady. He said, "Your father would have done the same thing." She said, "I know. That is why I am doing it." Jeremiah Kreger stood behind his father and did not say anything because Jeremiah Kreger was 20 years old, and he had spent the last 8 years in the Holden workshop learning what Della had spent her life learning. And he understood perhaps better than any other person in that yard, on that afternoon, what had just been preserved. The partnership held. It held through the rest of the 80s when the farm crisis ground its way through the rest of Adams County. It held through the early 90s when the corn came back. It held through Margaret's illness in 1991 and her recovery. And it held when the 2 younger Kreger boys went off to college and did not come home to farm. Jeremiah stayed. Jeremiah married a teacher from the Adams High School in 1988, a quiet woman named Frances Home, and they took the small farmhouse on the south corner of the Kreger place, and they had a son in 1990. They named Otto after the man who had drawn the blueprint that had built the tractor, that had saved the herd, that had started the entire long chain of obligation and friendship and inheritance that ran through all of their lives. Della handed the conversion business to Jeremiah in 1992. She was 54. He was 28. He had been ready for 10 years. He had been waiting because he was a respectful man and because she was not yet finished. When she finally said the words to him at the workbench on a Tuesday afternoon in March of '92, when she told him the shop was his now, and the customer list was his, and her name on the orders would be replaced by his, he did not say anything for a long minute. Then he said, "Della, I am only able to do this because of what you did for my father in 1984. She said, "You are able to do this because of what your father did for me in 1965 when he came over with a sledgehammer and fixed my east fence. Everything else is interest." The county fair in Adams County was held every August. The Adams County Historical Society contacted Della in the summer of 1998. They wanted to display the diesel Farmall Super M at the fair as part of a special exhibit on agricultural heritage. Della agreed. She had one condition. The display had to include a sign explaining the cost. The sign was made of painted plywood 3 feet by 4 feet, with lettering done by a sign painter from Adams who still practiced the trade by hand. It read, 1962 Farmall Super M Diesel Conversion. Tractor frame, $35. Continental CD193 diesel engine military surplus, $85. Adapter plate mounts. Hardware, $40. Total cost, $160. Hours logged, 18,000 plus. Performance, 58 horsepower 4 bottom plow capacity. Status still in daily farm use. Below that in smaller lettering. Built by Della Holden in her father's workshop, winter of 1967 to 1968. Otto Holden, master machinist, 1903 to 1965. The Adams County Fair opened on a Tuesday in the third week of August. Della stood by the display all day. She stood the way she did everything quietly without seeking attention, without narrating the story to every passerby. The tractor told its own story. The numbers on the sign told another. People approached, read the sign, looked at the tractor, and either walked on or stayed. The ones who stayed were mostly older men, farmers in their 60s and 70s who had lived through the era the tractor represented. Men who remembered the surplus sales at Fort McCoy and the cold winter of 1968 and the farm crisis of the 80s and the auctions that had claimed their neighbors' land. They stood in front of the display and looked at the numbers and ran the calculations in their heads and said very little because the calculations did not require commentary. $160, 18,000 hours, still running. The numbers were their own argument. Some of these men remembered the jokes from '67. They remembered laughing. They stood in front of the tractor now 31 years later, and the laughter was a long way away. Harlan Beckwith came by in the late afternoon. He was 73 years old. He had retired from the dealership in 1990 and sold the business to a younger man. He walked with a cane because his right knee had finally surrendered to 5 decades of climbing on and off tractor steps. His hair was white. His hands were spotted with age. But his grip when he shook Della's hand was still firm. He stood in front of the sign for a long time. He read the numbers. He added them up. He divided by the years of service. He calculated the cost per hour of operation, which was a number so small it was almost imaginary. He said, $160, she said. $160. He looked at her. He said, I sold John Deere's in this county for 43 years. I sold horsepower. I sold the future of American agriculture. That is what the brochures said, the future. And the woman who showed up at an auction in 1967 with a $35 engineless farm, all is the one whose machine is sitting in the fair as a piece of county history. And the John Deere's I sold are mostly scrapped or sitting in fence rows, she said. Your tractors were fine machines, Harlan. Well engineered, well built. I never said they were bad, he said. I know. That is what makes it worse. You never had to say it. You just kept building, and the building was the answer. He looked at the tractor for another long minute. He said, very quietly, more to himself than to her, the factory builds what it can sell. The machinist builds what she needs. Your father said that once. Otto said it to me in 1964 in front of the parts counter at the co-op. I laughed at him. I am ashamed of that too. He turned to go. He stopped. He turned back. He said, I have owed you something for 31 years, Della. I want you to know that I have carried it that long, and I have not been able to pay it. I am sorry for what I said in 1967, for what I told the men at the co-op, for what I made you carry while you were doing the work. I have been sorry for a long time, but I have never said it directly. I should have said it directly. I am saying it now, she said. Harlan, you said it in 1968, the morning you walked into the co-op without your hat. I heard about it within an hour. I have known what you said for 30 years. He blinked. He was quiet for a moment. He said, you knew. She said, I knew. He nodded. He looked at the tractor one more time. He walked away through the fair crowd leaning on his cane, an old man among other old men in the late August afternoon, and Della Holden watched him go and did not say anything else. A few minutes later, a small white-haired woman appeared at the edge of the display area. She was 81 years old. She was moving carefully the way people move whose balance is no longer automatic. She had been driven to the fair by her sister from Wisconsin Rapids, a drive of 45 minutes that she would not have been able to make alone. Eleanor Holden had not been to the Adams County Fair in 12 years. She had not been to the Holden farm in 4. The distance between her and her daughter was not geographical. It was the accumulated weight of 33 years of disagreement about what a life should look like and what a woman should do with a farm and a workshop and a set of machinist tools that had belonged to a dead man. Della had not known her mother was coming. She saw Eleanor at the edge of the display and felt something move in her chest that she had not felt in a long time. Something that was part surprise and part fear, and part of a hope she had stopped acknowledging years ago. Eleanor walked slowly to the Farmall. She put her hand on the frame rail, the same spot where Della had placed her hand 31 years earlier at the Kirchner auction. The spot where you could feel the weight and the balance and the solidity of the machine. Eleanor looked at the engine under the open hood. She would not have known a Continental CD193 from any other engine. She had never understood the machines or the shop or the hours Otto had spent there, or the hours Della had continued to spend there after Otto was gone. She had understood only that the shop had taken her husband and then her daughter, and that the taking had felt to her like a kind of loss that no precision could compensate. She looked at the sign. She read the numbers. She read the words at the bottom. Otto Holden Master Machinist, 1903 to 1965. She stood there. The fair crowd moved around her like water around a stone. Jeremiah Kreger, who had been working the other end of the display, saw who it was and stepped quietly back, understanding without being told that this moment was not his. His 8-year-old son, Otto, stood beside him and held his hand. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was thin and steady. The voice of a woman who had been carrying something for a very long time and was about to set it down. She said, "Your father would be so proud of you, Della." 6 words in the 33 years since Otto's death, through the arguments about selling the farm, through the long silences, through the phone calls that always ended the same way, through all the years of loving each other. Across a gap neither of them had known how to close. Eleanor had never said those words. She was saying them now, standing in front of the machine that proved them. Della put her arm around her mother's shoulders. Eleanor leaned into her daughter the way people lean into something solid when they are tired of standing alone. They stood together in front of the tractor that Otto Holden had imagined but never built. The tractor his daughter had constructed from his blueprint in his workshop with his tools during a winter so cold the metal stung her hands. The tractor that had plowed and hauled and endured for 30 years on an adapter plate machine by a woman who had been 29 and alone and determined to finish what her father had started. A few feet behind them, Jeremiah Kreger stood with his son Otto, and Otto looked up at his father and Jeremiah looked down at his son, and the small boy whose name carried forward the name of the man who had drawn the blueprint reached up and put his small hand on the cold steel of the frame rail of the tractor. For a moment, the 3 generations were together. The machinist who had drawn the blueprint, the wife who had loved him without understanding him, the daughter who had understood him completely and built the proof, and behind them in the boy who carried his name, the generation that would carry it further. Della said very quietly, "I know, Mama. I know he would be." The light was beginning to slant low across the fairgrounds. The shadows of the tents and the buildings were stretching east. Somewhere across the grounds, a band was tuning up for the evening program. The crowd was thinning towards supper. The diesel Farmall Super M, built for $160 in the winter of 1967, sat in the August light of 1998, with its hood open and its tag on it and its long story told. A factory builds what it can sell. A machinist builds what she needs. They had laughed when she bought a tractor with no engine. What she put inside it was her father's blueprint, her own hands, and the understanding that a machine is never dead, as long as someone knows how to imagine what it could become. Everything else, as Otto Holden had told her once at the lathe in 1953, while the blue chips fell into the chip pan with a sound like tiny bells. Everything else is just decoration.